Hello, everyone. I'm Peng Zhao from Oakland University, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you a rising star in our field, Dr. So Yang, as a speaker for today's seminar. And Dr. So Yang is a Richard and Barbara Nelson Assistant Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Minnesota. During 2017 to 18, he was a postdoctoral research associate in mechanical aerospace engineering at Princeton. And he received his PhD in aerospace engineering in 2017 from Georgia Tech under the supervision of Dr. Wenting Song and Dr. Victor Yang. And very impressively, he has 2 master degrees, and one in aerospace engineering and another one in computational science and engineering. His research focuses on the modeling and the simulation of laminar turbulent racking flows, including combustion, plasma, particulate, and multi-phase flows. He has authored more than 35 papers in refereed journals and conferences with a Google H index of 15. He's a member of the AIAA Propellants and Combustion Technical Committee. His research has been supported by NSF and Army Research Lab. And if you have any questions during the talk, please type it out using the chat function, and we shall collect and turn over to the speaker in the end. So Dr. Yang, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction from Peng. So hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the modeling and the analysis of sooting flames from our work in terms of turbulence, pressure, and chemical kinetics. So before I start, I first want to acknowledge all the other contributors for these works, including during my postdoc at Princeton, graduate student Jeff Liu and Professor Michael Mueller, and also after I joined Minnesota, the part of work was mostly done by my postdoc, Dr. Zhou, and my graduate student Shufan Zhou and undergraduate student Anders Wagge. Okay, so to save time, let me start. This is the outline of the talk. So the majority of our work is actually this part, but to talk about this part, I have to give a brief review of some basic about the soot modeling and the turbulence LES, and also the radiation flamelit progress variable modeling. And then because our modeling and analysis were built upon this. And here are the list of the 4 papers I'm going to talk about. Okay, let's start with the soot modeling. So because Luke just gave a talk 2 weeks ago, it's very good for me because many of you already have some knowledge about the soot modeling. Here I classify them into 3 categories. The first category is so-called stochastic model. So as we know, we have a lot of soot particles, maybe millions or even billions of particles. There's no way you can track them individually. So first idea is if we can't track them individually, let's do Monte Carlo to track some representative of them. And when you have a convergence of Monte Carlo, you should be able to rebuild your particle size distribution. Of course, this way to get the convergence, you really need a lot of particles. It's computationally expensive. The second way is the so-called sectional method. Sectional method is say you have a size distribution. You put many bins to describe them, and if you have enough bins, you can basically represent the distribution. Again, this just like the stochastic method is pretty accurate, flexible, but also it's expensive because, for example, even to resolve the size, you need say about 100 bins or sections. So that could be very expensive because you need to solve like say 100 transport equation for each sections. So before listen to Luke's talk, I thought these 2 methods, they are the most accurate one, I would say, but they're not very suitable for 3D or turbulent simulation because it's not computational affordable. But seems like Luke introduced this fancy machine learning technique to make them workable even for 3D turbulent. Okay, anyway, I go to my part. In our group, we use the method of moments. Because these two are too expensive, we rather than solve the PSD, we solve the statistical moments of PSD. And what does these moments mean? For example, the zeroth order moment you can imagine is the number density. First order moment is the volume fraction, and you can get high order moments. The advantage you can see is compared to all of this, you have many less transport equation to solve. It's much cheaper. Disadvantage is you don't directly have a distribution from your solution. You can try to reconstruct them, but reconstruction is not necessarily the accurate one as directly resolved by them. The transport equation looks like this. You still have convection term, thermophorus term, and the source term. We don't have diffusion term because for soot, it's a solid, the diffusivity is negligible. But to solve moments equation, you find you normally need more moments. It becomes a closure problem because you can only include a finite number of moments. So people raise many different ways to do this closure. And in our group, we use this so-called HMOM hybrid method moment introduced by Michael Mueller. And the basic idea is we know that we typically have this bimodal size distribution. So we can use delta function to represent the small size mode, the first mode, and log normal distribution for the second mode, because we know that most of the larger particle distribution will be close to this. And how accurate it is. So a few years ago, I coded up a sectional method to do the comparison. As you can see, for any quantities, the moment method can directly calculate. Its accuracy is basically the same as sectional method. You don't see any difference. And if you compare to experimental data for laminar flames, you can see how accurate they are. So I would say if you want a very accurate size distribution, you still need, say, sectional method or stochastic method. But if what we care is just the volume fraction, the moments, number density, moments method is definitely enough. Okay, so now let's talk about LES. So this is just a basic introduction. LES, we know that we have the turbulent energy cascade like this. And LES means we resolve large scales, but we don't resolve small scale, we model small scales. And however, combustion soot are often in the small scales, which makes modeling challenge. Okay, and in LES, our governing equation change, they become the filtered equation because your grid does not resolve all the scales, so everything is filtered. And we still have convection term, viscous stress, but because this filtering, you introduce some additional terms. Some people call it a subgrid skill SGS term. Some people call it a subfilter term. Anyway, they are the influence from the small scales to large scale. The benefit is you directly resolve the large scale. That means, people think the majority of turbulent energy is in large scale. So, and they are depending on geometry. So you want to resolve them. And small scale, people think they are close to isotropic turbulence, easier to model. So many people think LES is enough. However, we have combustion soot. They are the challenge. They make the small scale more difficult. Okay, that's about the LES in general. How about the combustion? For combustion coupling with the flow, here I'm going to talk about this RFPV model, radiation flame progress variable model. So the basic idea is still for the computational cost. If we have a big mechanism, let's say several hundred species, several thousand reactions, if you use finite rate, that's a nightmare because you have too many transport equations to solve. Okay, even if you do reduction, you still have too many. So the basic idea is, can we model the basic structure of the flame locally into some basic models like the counterflow and then we base on it to build a lookup table. And the key for lookup table is you need to set up several parameters. And in the RFPV model, I will show you which parameter to use. This figure is to show you how the table looks like. So we need to generate a lot of data point by the counterflow 1D simulation, and it's basically S-curve. But in addition to S-curve, for soot, radiation is very important. So we need to cover all the possible radiation levels. I only show 3 levels here to give you an example. In the real table, all of this space is filled. Okay, so what parameters we want to use for this RFPV, or you can call it a manifold model, whatever you want to name it. So in this model, any thermochemical variables can be considered as a function of mixture fraction, progress variable, and heat loss parameter. The reason we call it a radiation FPV is we introduce radiation by this heat loss parameter. Okay, this is from the 1D counterflow laminar flame simulation, right? There's no turbulence effect. So if you directly read this table in the turbulent combustion simulation, it's not going to work because there's no turbulence effect. So for any flame type model to consider turbulence effect, what you do is convolute your flame solution with so-called presumed subfilter PDF. So you do a convolution, and then this 3 parameter table become a 4 parameter table. You introduce a variance of the mixture fraction to represent the turbulence effect. Strictly speaking, we should also introduce a variance of C, variance of H, but based on many testing, variance of Z mixture fraction is the majority effect, and we don't want a too high dimension table. That will be huge because the 4-dimensional table is already size from 50 gigabyte to even larger, so we don't want to more. One last thing I want to mention for soot is, I know many people criticize the flammate type model because there are some assumption you prefer faster chemistry than flows. So normally that's okay in many regimes, but for soot, there's one thing very special is pH, polyaromatic hydrocarbons. pH is well known for its extremely slow chemistry, so there's no way you can handle it by any flamelet type table. So you shouldn't do that. The way is we use the table for other species, but for pH, we want to solve a transport equation. But for this transport equation, we don't want to solve too many transport equation because there's a lot of pH species. So we do a lumped pH species and solve one transport equation way. Okay, finally, I finished the background introduction for the methodology. Now we can go to what we did. Okay, so first, so now we talk about small scale. Small scale means subgrid scale modeling, SGS modeling, or you can call it subfilter modeling. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is about the transport property, diffusivity. If you look at the governing equation in RFPV model, we have a transport equation for mixture fraction, progress variable, heat loss term for radiation, pH, and soot. Okay, one thing I want to point out is look at this. Diffusivity for mixture fraction, diffusivity for progress variable. What is this? For any, originally in the finite rate simulation, for any species, we know the diffusivity. We can get a diffusivity, we can calculate the molecular diffusivity, and we can calculate turbulent diffusivity. We sum them up together. Here, mixture fraction and progress variable, they are not a species. What are their diffusivity? So typically, we get their diffusivity by assuming Lewis number equal to 1, because they are controlled by the major heat release species, and in the next slide you will see they indeed have Lewis number equal to 1. But if you do that, how can you capture the differential diffusion? How can you capture if in certain region the molecular diffusion is important? How can you capture that? The way is record that we get the table from the 1D counterflow diffusion flame, and you can try to capture those molecular differential diffusion there, but there's some problem there. That's why we do this study. So let's look at this. In the LES of non-premix combustion, it's often assumed unity Lewis number, effective unity Lewis number. The reason is for most of the species, their length scale is close to the mixing zone thickness. And this length is normally much higher than the Kolmogorov scale, which makes the molecular diffusion not that important, and the turbulent diffusivity will dominate everything. So if you see this comparison, you can see that if we consider both, one of the solution, so this is DNS data, one of the solution consider the molecular diffusivity, one of the DNS didn't consider molecular diffusivity, they just directly use Lewis number equal to 1. You can see they get basically the same solution, because molecular diffusion is not important at all. However, for soot, we know that one key thing is pH. And we know that pH is super slow chemistry. And if you see some DNS data, you can find, okay, soot is located only in certain region. And if you look at this region, you can find they have a pretty low scalar dissipation rate. Whenever you have high scalar dissipation rate, high flow strain rate, there will not be any pH there. So this makes the pH to be spatially intermittent. They are limited to regions at the scale of Kolmogorov scale or even smaller. For this reason, molecular transport must be important for this type of species. Okay, so if that's important, can we just use molecular diffusion for everything? For pH, of course, it's important, and if you want to get accurate one, you want to use that. However, for other things, for the OH, for temperature, you see, if you use purely molecular diffusion, then you make a mistake, because the turbulent diffusion is actually dominant. And if you do 1D solution by that way, you can find you are way off from the real solution from DNS data. On the other hand, if you 1D solution use unity Lewis number, you match with the DNS data. So here is the dilemma. So some want a unity Lewis number, some want a molecular diffusion. How can we handle them? The way is, can we handle them simultaneously for different species? Based on this idea, we introduced this so-called strain-sensitive parameter. So we want to apply the molecular diffusion only to strain-sensitive species. We define a strain-sensitive parameter based on the scalar dissipation rate to represent the strain rate, flow strain rate, and also this production rate to represent the chemistry. So you can see that we can classify the species. For certain species, they have slow chemistry. That means they are strain sensitive. Then we use the molecular diffusion. For other species, they have fast chemistry. So we use the unity Lewis number. Okay, so that's the basic idea. How do we use this? We use this parameter to define our effective Lewis number, and then we insert this effective Lewis number to the flamelet equation, governing equation, derived by Heinz pitch. So here, some term inside here and here. Okay, so first we do a priori analysis with respect to DNS, and you can see that our method and the unity Lewis sum method match with the DNS data very well. But if you use the molecular differential diffusion one, they're way off for both temperature and OH. So of course we can't do this. However, for A2, you can see if you use unity Lewis number, you get this curve. If you use the molecular diffusion model, you get better. And our new model, surprisingly, is even better than the molecular diffusion one, is this one. Okay, but of course, you can imagine OH and temperature nowadays, people already get very high accuracy. pH there are always some more larger uncertainty, as you can imagine. Okay, and if we apply to the LES, this is Adelaide flame 1, 2, 3. I show you flame 2 and the Sandia Sooting flames. Okay, if you see the temperature, just as we expected, if you do the pure molecular differential diffusion, you even cannot capture your temperature, but the other two can. How about the soot volume fraction? Soot volume fraction for magnitude, the new method or unit Lewis number or whatever method you use, they didn't show much benefit. The key thing I want to point out is the new method have a more accurate location of the peak soot volume fraction. Okay, so the benefits is not very obvious here because the major deviation is magnitude. And so we will go to our next model to handle the magnitude. Okay, so next model is about the soot subfilter PDF. As I mentioned, we need to convolute with the PDF before we using the table in the LES. Okay, so presume subfilter PDF, how to use that. As I mentioned, in LES, all the equation become a filtered equation. So now let's look at soot moment equations. Look like this. Okay, we still have convection and thermophoresis lumped in this term. We have unresolved turbulent mixing, or we can call it a subfilter scalar flux. This is well studied, and people can use just a Smog-Rinsky model for it. The key challenge is the source term. How to handle the source term closure? The way is we convolute with the subfilter PDF. Okay, and this PDF can be further decomposed into a thermochemical PDF and condition soot PDF, but conditioned on the thermochemical variable. The first one is also well studied. People normally use beta distribution for it. The second one is our challenge, and that's what we need to do. Okay, but to model the second one, we need some motivation. The motivation is from both experiments and also DNS data. We can see that we have very fine spatially intermittent structure that are not resolved in the LES grid. We put LES grid over the DNS data. And on many of the grid LES cell, you don't even have soot. So intermittency is the motivation. How do we model intermittency? We normally use delta function, right? So this is introduced by Michael, introduce soot mode and non-sooting mode. And we use this omega to represent the intermittency. And we have a constant MJ star here. We set this constant, we need to derive a formula for it such that when you convolute, you still get the correct average value. The key simplification here is originally we have a conditional PDF, conditional on thermochemical variable. Now we simplify to a marginal PDF, no dependence on thermochemical variable. And Michael's original argument is like this: soot evolves on much longer time scale than gas phase chemistry is very slow chemistry. So because of this time scale discrepancy, he think we can get rid of this condition. Okay, is that true? That's first test. For temperature, again, it's good. For soot volume fraction, what's the result? For Adelaide flame 2, we get a factor of 80 deviation. For Sandia Sooting flame, factor of 20 deviation. Recall that we tried the lambda flame. It's highly super accurate, right? When you go to turbulence, the story completely changed. Now the uncertainty is so high. And many other groups tried, including the Caltech group and the Michigan group. All of them have such large deviation from the experimental data. And in the past, people basically multiply the prediction by 100 or 40 or something to compare with the experimental data, say, we got the right trend, but the value is way off. Okay, but of course, this is not acceptable. So one idea is the chemical mechanism the reason. We tested the different chemical mechanism. They can only give a factor of 4 difference. So definitely not the reason. So it must be the SGS model issue. Okay, how to resolve it? We go back to the detailed Sooting process. We have the coagulation, condensation, surface growth, oxidation, fragmentation. So what I did was we look into all the detailed process, and we found that nucleation and condensation, they are pH-based process. They are indeed super slow, super slow. Okay, so your original assumption is okay. However, surface growth, depending on the acetylene Haka mechanism, is pretty fast actually. Oxidation, depending on OH and oxygen, is super fast. So these two actually as fast as the heat release reactions. That means the original assumption of the decoupling, say your conditional PDF can become a marginal PDF, is wrong because of this. Okay. And we also did the regime diagram. This is dominated by nucleation condensation region. This is surface growth dominant region. This is oxidation dominant region. And we found that, at least based on DNS data, once you enter an oxidation dominant region, oxidation is super fast. All the soot will be killed immediately. So you shouldn't have any soot in the oxidation region. But in the old model, they assume there's still many soot here. So the oxidation was over predicted. That's why you have so low prediction from the LES. Okay, so we introduce a new model. We want to keep the conditional PDF. The only simplification is we simplify this to Z, mixture fraction, rather than all the thermochemical variables. Okay, and how do we do that is original have a constant and now make it a mixture fraction of Z. And the functional formula of this is we introduce a Heaviside function and this so-called cutoff mixture fraction. Cutoff mixture fraction, we basically try to determine the a region where oxidation is dominant. Whenever oxidation is dominant, we shouldn't have soot there. But how to determine that? The way is we dynamically compare the oxidation rate with surface growth rate. This will form the boundary between the two regions. Okay, so we do that dynamically in the code to get this value. And you can see if we do that, oxidation over prediction will be significantly reduced. Surface growth will be slightly reduced, so hopefully okay. Nucleation and condensation will not be affected at all. Okay, so let's see the results. This is the temperature, again, is good. And for the soot volume fraction, originally we have 80% deviation, 20% deviation. Now everything is within a factor of 5. So this is much better. Okay, so it's much better than the state of art before. And the way is we add more physics. Okay, and if we do some testing about the grid, we find this. If we get a finer grid, we can actually be getting closer to the experimental data. This is another evidence to prove that the reason for the deviation is really come from turbulence. Okay, and why we can get this? We did error quantification based on DNS data, and we found that, as you know, if we resolve everything, we have almost no error, which is here. This is DNS point, and then you increase the grid size. Increase grid size, your error will increase. But a good SGS model, your error increase will saturate. For condensation, for surface growth, is indeed saturated. However, if you see the old model for oxidation, it keep on rising. But for our new model, it got flat or sometimes even can decrease. So this is why our new model is better. And why we can show this? Because if we have, say, this red curve is a grid like here, the blue curve, you get a finer grid, you may go to here. You still get a lower error. Okay. Another thing we compare is if we change the chemical mechanism, because I mentioned that the uncertainty is a factor of 4. Now we have factor of 5 from the experimental data. If we use the causal mechanism rather than the NBPP mechanism, we actually get a very good result. This, I would say, is the best prediction so far in any work. Okay, so we got such a good model, and the project was sponsored by NASA with a partner with Rolls-Royce. So Ananda's group in Rolls-Royce started using our model for their EDS rig and real combustors. I can tell you they feel our implementation is a little complicated. We use a dynamic determination of the Z-cut. They call it the Z-suit. They don't want to have too complicated implementation, so they set it as a constant parameter and play with it. But you can see, even set it as a constant and play with it, still get much better result than before. This is the before result. This is the experimental data. You can see using our new model, they can match the experimental results much better, at least qualitatively. Okay, another thing I want to mention is Ananda talked to me once, say, our real engine is always high pressure, but most of the fundamental study come from 1 atm or very low pressures. Can you guys do more studies on high pressures? I say, of course, yes. So we collaborate with the causal side to test their newly generated Ken flames, which have elevated pressures. Of course, the pressure is not that high, but I think this is a good starting point to study the high pressure Sooting flames. So here is the result. Again, we get a very good prediction, especially for 3 bar. We don't have any uncertainty. It's almost a match with experimental data. For 1 bar, we get under prediction by 4 times. For 5 bar, over prediction for 4 times. This is an interesting phenomenon. Why we have under prediction for low pressure, over prediction for high pressure? We don't know. This is looks like the SGS model have some sensitivity to pressure. We want to study this in the future. Another thing I want to point out is there's another work did test this flame, which is from the Linderstedt group. And they use transport PDF method plus sectional method. Sectional method, as I mentioned to you, consider as very accurate for soot modeling. Transport PDF method considered as very accurate for turbulent combustion. They put these two together, but you see the accuracy is the same as ours. It didn't give it much better accuracy. But we know that these two methods are much more expensive than our method. So we use a much cheaper way to get the same accuracy. Okay, so now let's go to the last part. So I mentioned here, we might want to study SGS modeling for high pressure later. We haven't done that. Another part may be sensitive to high pressure is the chemical kinetics. So let's study chemical kinetics. But if you want to study chemical kinetics, you want to get rid of turbulence effect. Otherwise, they couple together. You don't know what we are talking about. So we get back a little bit. Now let's look at the laminar flame. We got the case from the ISF International Sooting Flame Workshop, the 4th workshop, target flame 2, again from cost. This one have elevated pressure from 1 to 16 atm. Okay. And for chemical mechanism, we tested 3 mechanisms. The first one is NBP. It have pH up to A4R5. Second one is a reduced version of this one. They only keep A2 as the 2-ring aromatic pH as their precursor. They manually delete C9H7, C9H8, and all the species between A2R5 and A4R5. And the last mechanism we test is reduce the cost mechanism because the full cost mechanism is too large, too expensive. This one have pH up to A7. So we want to see the effect of the high order pH species. Okay, so first, this here is the simulation result. Again, this is laminar flames. We are able to get very accurate results for laminar flames. Here you see how accurate it is. But you can see when you increase the pressure, the spatial distribution become more and more different. Okay, so low pressure, we have better prediction, broader flame, and soot will peak near the center line. High pressure, larger discrepancy, narrow flame, and soot will peak on the flame wind in both simulation and experimental data. So there are several questions we want to answer. Where the uncertainty come from? Why high pressure you move to flame wind? Because this is a laminar flame, we know HMOM is highly accurate and there's no turbulence effect. So the answer must come from chemical kinetics. So first, let's look at the chemistry. We fortunately have some chemistry species measurement from the cost side, and you can see that we have over prediction for C2H2 A1, but we have under prediction for A2 and A3. In addition, for C2H2 and A1, even for high pressure, the error is not that large. But for A2 and A3, we have a huge error for high pressures. So one hint is very obvious. We must have something missing between A1 and A2, or something very inaccurate. So that's the place we want to improve the mechanism. But to do so, we need some tools. The tool is here. So for any chemical mechanism, the key question is, we want to improve it, but where to improve it? The most traditional way is you do sensitivity analysis like many people did in the past week, the flame chemistry workshop. But when you have thousands of reactions, how can you do sensitivity analysis? There's no way. You always need some method to narrow down to a certain reactions, then you do that. And the typical way is you do some sort of path flux analysis. These are some example: DRG, DRGP, PFA, and several years ago when I was in Wenting's group, we introduced this GPS SGPA. So the key benefit for this new method is from this figure. So DRG is the most original one. It's essentially a local greedy algorithm. For example, you start with a few. You check the strength of each path flux. And you find, okay, this is 31%, this 23%. So this one is important. Let's go with this one. However, we have, say, 23%. Later, they may merge to 69%. This is actually the dominant one, but you miss it because of this greedy algorithm. Then later, PFA method introduced by Wenting, he said, okay, let's consider 2 generations. Maybe we can solve this issue. But how about it converge in the 3rd generation or 4th generation? So the final solution is we need to look at the big picture. So the way is we set a starting species and species. We use graph theory to find all the possible loop, all the possible paths between the starting species and the final species. Okay, so that's much better. However, all of this still are controlled by fast heat release kinetics. None of them can handle the slow formation and the evolution of pollutant like soot and NOx because they are weak. Their path flux are weak. You will ignore them. So how to handle that? The good news is this GPA method actually is very suitable. You can set the soot or PAH as your sink or hub species. Sink species means you have a starting species, you have end species, you set so ending species called sink species. Hub species means if you know some certain intermediate species is very important, you set it as a hub. And in the graph theory algorithm, you enforce it. All the paths must go through it. By this way, we can understand the kinetics even for the slow emission chemistry. Okay, so first we apply it to use A2 as the sink species. And for 1 ATM, we find the dominant pathway is this. For 8 and 12 ATM, dominant pathway is this. If you compare these two, they share the green part, which we have a pretty good prediction. They also share the red part. We have a pretty bad prediction for high pressure, but a pretty good prediction for low pressure. So if you compare, the only difference is this part and this part. But we know that 1 ATM prediction is pretty good. So for high pressure, this link must be the problem. If we go to the mechanism for this link, only one reaction is there. So the way forward is we need some quantum chemistry people or some good experimentalists to get more accurate rate coefficient for this one. Once that is done, all this prediction will be significantly improved by just improve one reaction. So you can see how powerful this tool is. I know quantum chemistry people and also experimentalists are very good at improve the rate coefficient for reactions, but they need someone like us to tell them which one they should improve to solve the real problem. Okay, now let's apply it to soot. So apply to soot we do a spatial SGPA. The way to do that in the whole computational domain for every grid point, we do the SGPA to find the dominant pathway at each location. And we mark different dominant pathway with different color. And then side by side, we compare them with volume fraction, nucleation source term, condensation source term, surface growth source term, and you can do more source term. And for the peak value, peak location of each source term, you can find the corresponding dominant pathway. This is the way we can figure out that. So for one ATM, we find the nucleation dominated by this pathway, condensation by this. The major findings is major soot precursor for one ATM is only A2R5. First ring A1 formation, many of them contribute from the C3H3 recombination. pH growth is either HACA or C9H8 to C9H7 reactions. This for nucleation and condensation. For HACA surface growth, we only have one, which is GP6. Now let's look at 4ATM. 4ATM, of course, we get a different global pathway. And major soot precursor, in addition to A2R5, now we have A2 as well. First ring formation, C3H3 recombination is no more important. So no matter how much you improve its rate coefficient, it won't help for high pressure. pH growth is similar as before. HACA surface growth. Originally, we only have one path is like this. Now we have three more paths also important, and they dominate on the flame wing. 12 ATM. 12 ATM, one important change is now we have a new path dominate on the flame wing. And for the major soot precursor, originally we have A2R5 and A2. Now at a very high pressure, we only have A2. pH growth is still similar. HACA surface growth, similar to before. Again, we have something on the flame wing. Mainly because now we have a new path of condensation dominant on the flame wing. That's why at the 12 ATM, the soot will peak on the flame wing, unlike 1 and 4 ATM. So we answered the question at the beginning of this part. Okay, so that's for the first task. Second task is we want to see the effect of mechanism reduction. We know that by this reduction, they get rid of C9H7, C9H8, and anything between A2R5 and A4R5. Okay, and what we found is now, if you use this reduced mechanism, you get a very different spatial distribution at 4 ATM. Specifically, 4 ATM, we should still get a peak at the center line based on experimental data and the detail mechanism. But this reduced mechanism now, the soot is peak on the wing, on the flame wing. So why is that? We check the flame wing, we check the flame wing global pathway, found the key difference is condensation. And we found, based on the global pathway analysis, we found the two key paths miss in the reduced mechanism, which results in this wrong distribution, spatial distribution. And if you look at these two, you find this is because they got rid of C9H7, C9H8, and A2R5. If we get them back, they won't have this error. So now you can see manually generated reduced soot mechanism is so dangerous. In the future, we will use our SGPA method to develop a new automatic and objective reduction tool to generate pH soot reduced mechanism accurately. But the key thing is we need a database. Unlike the traditional 1D or 0D auto-ignition database like a Tianpeng Lu's group to generate reduced mechanism, now we need a soot version of that database. Okay, the last thing I want to mention is the last task. We test the reducer cost mechanism. They also include the A5 to A7. We want to know, are they really important? So the first finding is, if you look at a single pathway of A2 between of any species in A5 to A7, standard alone, none of them are important. So actually, they are not important. However, if we sum them up, we see the combined effect, and we calculate the dominancy of the combined pathway for all of this, and compared to the dominant pathway of the whole system, you find they are comparable. So the combined effect is actually important. So what's the hint of this to us? Hint to us is, in your mechanism, if you actually give very detailed elemental reaction for A5 to A7, your mechanism become much larger, much more expensive. But it does not worth to do so, because standalone, they are not significant at all. So the right way to do that efficiently is we should generate a mechanism with a lumped A5 to A7. Then it's much cheaper, and only the lumped one have significant effect. Okay, so here is the summary of all the SGPA analysis I did to save time. I don't want to go over it. And here is the outline again to show you what I talked today. So I think time's already up. So let me finish the talk. So finally, this is the beautiful campus picture of our Universal Minnesota campus to show you. And this is the remote view of Minneapolis downtown. And the work, as I mentioned, at Princeton was partially sponsored by NASA, and at Minnesota, partially sponsored by NSF. Part of our simulation was done on the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute, so I also acknowledge here. Okay, that's all my talk, and I can answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the very insightful talk. And I do have 3 questions. So let me share my screen. The first question is from Luke, and he said, you neglect SGS fluctuations of progress of reactions, which is implicitly assuming that the reaction zones are fully resolved. So what is your mesh resolution?
I would say this. One idea is the reaction zone is fully resolved. The other idea is the reactions are fast enough. We know that the sooting flame, if you want to generate soot, you have really high temperature flame, high temperature reaction. It's not like the cool flame, you might have a slower one. And when you have fast enough reactions, this SGS fluctuation of the progress variable is indeed not that significant. That's my answer. And mesh resolution, I cannot be sure is a mesh resolution, at least based on our comparison with the experimental data, we think is at least good enough for heat release reaction, at least good enough for temperature, OH, all those things. It might not be good enough for soot, as I already showed the grid resolution test. But that's an issue for the subfilter modeling to be further improved.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for the very good answer. The second question, third question, actually from me, I totally understand you're dealing with a very challenging problem, and it's you got very good physical and chemical insights from this problem. The second question is, can you evaluate the contribution of each process to the uncertainty of soot modeling? For example, which can be affected by the gas phase chemistry and different precursors, molecular transport, Surround diffusion, radiation, turbulent model. So how are these complexity individually affect the soot volume fraction from your model results?
Okay, so this is a very good question. I mean, why sooting flame is so challenging is because of all this coupling. I would say scientifically, the best way to evaluate this uncertainty is to evaluate them one by one, standalone. For example, if you want to look at the gas phase chemistry, I would say go to do the laminar sooting flame. If you couple it in the turbulent sooting flame, there's no way you can evaluate the gas phase chemistry very well. And the radiation model, actually, Professor Xingyu Zhao did many good work. And I think the way is also you want to have a problem, maybe even not a combustion problem, to test the radiation model to quantify the uncertainty before you move it into your Sooting flames. So I would say like that. I will try to decouple them to quantify the uncertainty one by one.
Okay, that's great. So actually, when you compare your modeling with the experiment, discrepancy is there. How are you going to explain that? I think that is kind of my major question.
There are many possibilities. For example, the one I showed, first we think it might be chemical kinetics, so we tried a different one. It didn't, almost not much difference.
Okay.
Chemical kinetics for laminar flames makes a big difference. For turbulent flame, didn't make too much difference because the deviation is already so high. Okay. That's why we think, okay, turbulence must be the issue.
Okay, great. So the third question is, I think the SGPA analysis is very impressive. But in addition to the kinetics and different pathways you're talking about, the pressure can also have physical effects such as the density, which might affect the radiation models, and molecular diffusivity, and also the flame thickness. As you can see, your flame becomes thinner. That affects the temperature gradient, which further affects the Sarai effects. So how would you consider this?
Yes. So first, the radiation density change, molecular diffusion change, flame thickness change, all of this is captured in the simulation directly. So I think first, they are accurate. Second thing is that we actually did test the influence on radiation. And I didn't show that slides, but it's in our paper. So we did a test, and radiation is not the major contribution to the difference, as we already quantified. And other things, so I would say this. When we do SGPA, we can do it for any location. In the first version of the paper, we actually submitted to the symposium and didn't get accepted because at that moment, we only pick several grid points as a sample to do the test. And the reviewer said it can be very misleading because at a different location, you can get a very different result. That's why this time we do it for the whole domain. And we can see the big picture. And I would say in that way, we can handle any misleading conclusion.
Yeah, so you mean the SGPA method can be used as both local computational diagnostics based on the local species concentration, but also
it can give you any local
as a global tool.
Yeah.
So we actually you can select a point within the flame zone and also to the region where you have high soot volume flux.
Yeah, it will be misleading if you decide to choose which local point. So the objective way is don't make that assumption. Do it for everywhere, and then look at the result to understand it.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, we actually start to use it for turbulent combustion as well, and we have some results, but to be finished the work. So
yeah, the next question from Niels is, how close to reality do you think the SGPA analysis is, and what would you need to get closer to the physical chemical reality of PAH soot formation?
Okay, so SGPA analysis is a post-processing tool, I would say. How reality it is depending on how reality your simulation is. And based on our comparison with experimental data, we think is highly accurate because for low pressure is indeed very, very accurate. For high pressure, we have a deviation, but we get all the qualitative features. Like if it should pick in the center line, it pick in the center line. If it should pick on the wing, it pick on the wing.
Okay, great. The next question is from Professor Zhu. Soot modeling is very challenging because of so many complicated processes. If soot oxidation is important at high pressure, can the kinetic model even predict the key radical more fractions like hydrogen radical, oxygen radical, OH at high pressure? I found it's even difficult to find the HO and OH in hydrogen flames.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say I agree. I agree with it very much. If we cannot handle the major heat release combustion well, there's no way you can handle soot well because it's even more challenging. So, of course, we need to get a very good temperature, OH, H, and all species. That's for sure. Yeah. So I would say, but for the simulation, we consider the pressure is not that high, and as we can see for temperature and OH species prediction, even high pressure is pretty good. Maybe even higher pressure, it could be not that good. I don't know.
Okay, thank you for the answer.
I saw Professor Jay Gore have a question. Do you intend to apply this to diesel engine or gas turbines? So my answer is it's already applied to gas turbine. I mean my subfilter turbulent modeling. And as I showed, another group in Rolls-Royce already applied to gas turbine, get much better than state-of-art results, as the slide I showed. And I believe for diesel engine, no one have applied it yet, but it should also get much better result.